for has finally arrived. It's time for TMI, Confessionals of the Nerd Kind. And now, your hosts, Jeff Nerfherder Chandler, Jim Kaiju Baker, and Christina Yojimbo Henry. You can continue. And now, let's get on with the show. Here is TMI.
Welcome, everyone. Our second book club episode. And judging from the listens, I think that Death on the Nile went down very well. I'm glad for that we have some literary followers out there. Maybe it's just relegated to Agatha Christie, but Stephen King's a pretty big name, so maybe we'll get some more.
Listen, I was going to say, I think we'll find out. King's up there. It
just brings a new facet to this show, an exciting one, I think, because I really look forward to these now.
I think it's really fun to, a lot of times I'll go and read the book anyway. So it's kind of fun to have that conversation with you guys as well, because they are different medium. And I think that's part of the conversation is that, you get one thing from a book and you get a different thing from a movie.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially if you're a fan of the book pre-movie, that could bring out feelings of anger when you see the movie, or it's a very different experience reading the book first, then seeing the movie, then seeing the movie first, and then reading the book because your opinion is colored by one or the other, invariably.
2 minutes in on Christine and I was already mad. So.
Of the movie?
Of the movie.
Or the book?
Yeah.
2 minutes in, there's like 5 pages. So I hope
I'm talking about the movie. I'm talking about the movie, but we will get into it.
Yeah, because Christine by Stephen King is what we are talking about today. And I picked this as our second book club episode because going back to when I was 12, when this thing was first published, and this may speak to my father's dubious parental decisions, allowed me to, read Stephen King books because he was a member of one of these Columbia House type clubs, but for books. And it was a sci-fi book club. And they would send him a new book every month. And he was already a Stephen King fan. So somehow Stephen King ended up in the sci-fi fantasy book club and he would get these books. So the new Stephen King would invariably always be on our shelf. And for some reason, this is before the movie came out. Obviously, we got the book Christine in 1983, whenever it was published during that year. And I wanted to read it. And maybe because it was about a car, I wasn't really that into cars, but I just wanted to read it anyway. It was kind of like Ernie being fascinated by this car and not knowing why. I just read it and I loved it. I was only 12 at the time, so I couldn't speak to the teenage story. It was just maybe of an idealized teenage lifestyle that I had in my head. Maybe that was what made it so impressive to me. And the themes about growing up, because there's a lot has been made about, how this speaks to the American obsession with the motor car and things like that. But I feel more it's about parents letting go of their kids, because that's really, in a way, what happens to Ernie, and his parents can't deal with it. It's to the extreme with Ernie, I will say, but I think the theme is there.
I definitely think it is. I think this book is really an allegory for the way that kids change when they become teenagers, and how they become something unknowable to you as a parent. And I think that's really, there's one scene in particular that really exemplifies that. And it's a scene where Michael is reminiscing about Ernie riding his tricycle on the street. And he's remembering Ernie in his little blue corduroy overalls, riding this, red tricycle that they got from a rummage sale. And he said his hair was flopping over his face. And then he realized that he doesn't know who his son is anymore. Stephen King, I think, is one of the most nostalgic writers out there. I mean, he polishes childhood and adolescence to a fine gloss in almost all of his books. He's very, very, he has a very romantic view of anyone who's sort of pre-adulthood. And I think the only writer who's more nostalgic about those things is Ray Bradbury.
Yeah, because Stephen King somehow is so tapped in to that childhood experience, because obviously we don't just see it here. It's not really childhood because, well, it is, because these teenagers reminisce a lot about when they were kids. But, you know, Stand By Me is the obvious one that comes up, that he really gets that. And it's, you know, as an adult reading that, you realize that you've forgotten those days to a large extent. And reading a Stephen King book that's set in that genre really brings it back, you know, what it's like to be a kid. And I applaud him for keeping tabs on that side of himself, so much so, and able to bring that back so viscerally in a book like Christine. But the story of Christine is pretty simple. It's a nerd, a put upon nerd. And this is also probably why I liked it, because this was pretty much me back in 8th, 9th grade. I sympathized with Ernie. Inexplicably, his best friend is the popular jock in school, Dennis. But as little kids, they had bonded, and that friendship survived high school, and they're still friends. And Dennis kind of looks out for Ernie, but, you know, he's still the nerd. It begins in the summer, this book, before they go back to school for their last year of high school. And they're driving back home from work because they work together, and they see an old wreck of a car, a 58 Plymouth Fury, on a lawn, parked there for sale sign. And Ernie flips out. Dennis doesn't see it at first. Ernie does, makes him go back. And that's when this whole thing starts. He wants the car. He meets the owner, Roland de la Bay, who has something in his eye. And he's a very cantankerous, lecherous old man who's railing against his word, the who made him fail his eye exam. So that's why he can no longer drive Christine. And he clearly has loved this car. And Ernie will do whatever it takes, whatever it costs to get this car. So that's the setup. And it throws his life into turmoil. And this could be a book by itself without the supernatural elements. But of course, it's Stephen King. So something very evil is afoot.
Hey, Jeff, when was the first time you read this book?
I did read it in high school. And I think I mentioned the fact that about the only thing I really took away was the lighting of the farts and the pooping on the dashboard. Yeah, those were
That's
like
all you remember.
That really, I mean, yeah, because I think what happened was I was going through you know what it was is that we did have Stephen King books in the house, and Pet Sematary, like I actually had to put that book down and not go back to it for quite a while before I finally finished it up. Yeah, I don't know. You know, reading this book as a kid, you know, maybe I didn't appreciate, you know, what was going on. As an adult now, watching it, you know, reading it and you know, seeing it from the parents' point of view, you know, and Ernie's he's stretching out and he's becoming his own kind of person. And, you know, exactly what you guys say, which is parents just wake up one day and you realize that your kids are not those little 4-year-olds running around. They're fully realized human beings, and they have their own feelings. I really enjoyed reading this the second time.
I couldn't put it down. And this is why when I was a kid, when I first read this, I loved it. I probably read it twice during that year before the movie came out in December of '83. And that's the crazy thing, is that King was such a hot commodity that this book was being filmed as a movie as it hit #1. So there was very little separation between the book being out and the movie being in production. So I probably read it a couple of times before the movie came out, and then probably 4 or 5 times more throughout my adolescence and going into high school. And then I kind of put it down and focused on other things. And it's been several years since I read it. And reading it this time, it was just like back then. I could not put it down. I was looking forward every day to ending my workday and reading more of Christine, which is a great feeling.
I didn't read this until I was 15 or 16. And that was partially because I was a fantasy reader for a long time. And so my entryway into Stephen King was The Eyes of the Dragon. And then I kind of read his fantasy and like fantasy adjacent books. So I read The Talisman and I read The Stand, but I didn't know if I wanted, because everyone talked about how scary his books were. And I was like, I don't know if I want to read, something super, super scary. And as a 12, 13-year-old, I had a very vivid imagination. I was very traumatized by scary things. So I waited, and then I read Christine, and I remember starting it, at like 7, 8 o'clock at night and still being up at 2 a.m, just trying to read the whole thing in one night. Not because it was so scary, but because it is suspenseful, and it makes you feel throughout this sense of dread and unease that you get.
Yeah, very much so.
It comes from primarily the responses of the people around Ernie. It comes from Dennis. It comes from Michael, especially Ernie's father. And I think that this will be the first point of comparison for me anyway, for the movie, is that you don't get that in the film because you don't get to spend as much time with those characters. And
no, it'd be a 4-hour movie though if that was the case. You have to drop something, and I understand
but still,
the decisions that they made.
Yeah, we talk about the fact that it's 2 different mediums. The audiobook for this is 22 and a half hours long.
Yeah.
Stephen King loves to write and go down these rabbit holes, but it paints this broader picture of this world that these characters are living in.
And this is a moderately sized Stephen King book as well. It's not The Stand. I wonder how long the unabridged Stand audio book is.
Yeah. But the movie does a huge disservice. Like I said, 2 minutes in, not even 2 minutes, and I'm already upset with the movie because we're going to just ignore the whole LeBay haunting, and it's possessed from the day it came out of the...
They are if you accept it as 2 different things, then
I agree. But all the elements are there in the movie. All the elements from the books are there. The one thing that's really great when you're reading these, each chapter has its own soundtrack. He literally starts with a couple lines from a song. And it's always, the rock and roll stuff from the 50s or 60s. And it kind of paints that picture. Dennis narrates 3/4 of this book. You don't get that in the movie whatsoever. So you're losing, like Ernie literally transforms within the first 10 minutes.
I wanted to touch on that. Ernie transforming. He does so in the book as well. From the first, and it's even less so, I think, because reading this now, talking about like how you get a different feel when you're an adult and when you're a kid, I think that King, in the one thing that I'll say about the downfall of the book, doesn't paint Ernie enough as that like lovable nerd that Dennis loves. You only get that really in the flashbacks. And I don't think the Ernie in the book fights enough. There's these scenes in the pizza parlor when he's trying to call people and he's desperate. And whenever he's away from the car, he's kind of becomes himself again. But you see more of the bad Ernie in the book than you see the good Ernie. So now reading it now, it's hard to be as sympathetic to him as I was when I was a kid. And you don't really understand what his fascination with the car is. Is it possessing him the minute that it sees him? In the movie, it has that line about, well, maybe I've seen something that's even uglier than I am, but I don't think the book Ernie would ever say that about Christine.
In the book, I think that part of the immediate transformation comes from him digging in his heels, where Dennis is saying, what the heck are you doing? Like, this is a piece of garbage. This guy is taking you for a ride. He's charging you so much money for this car that's worth like $20, if that. And Ernie's like, no, I want it. And then he comes home, and then his parents push him on it. And then he digs in his heels more. So I think what you see is that line. And Jim, I know your son's not a teenager yet, but they have this point.
Oh, I've been there. My daughter. Yeah. Once they
just dig in. Yeah. They just dig it, and it's just like this bright red line where they dig in, and you're saying to yourself, when did you stop being reasonable? When did it become a point where I was unable to reach you? And that, I think, is one of the reasons why Ernie seems like he transforms so quickly, not necessarily because of the car per se, not because of the car's possessing him, but because the car is something that he wants. And this is where he's decided to draw the line. This is where he's digging in.
But I think that the car has something to do with it, or the book wouldn't go where it does. Because he also digs in against Dennis. He's fighting Dennis just as much as he is his parents.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. He is digging in against Dennis too, but it just becomes something that he wants.
Not only is Ernie's transformation obviously to the extreme, but his parents as well are controlling to the extreme, especially his mother, Regina. She's digging in on her side just as much as Ernie is digging in and is affronted by this.
Because the kid has never pushed back on her.
Yeah.
They pretty much, instill their will on him and do whatever he's told.
And they take it for granted that he will do it because he's never fought back before. And this is why it's so upsetting to them and they don't know how to deal with it. Obviously, they don't know how to deal with it. I don't think anybody would know how to deal with a possessed car, but that's talking about King's, just his idiosyncrasies as a writer. I love these little asides, literary allusions. Every once in a while, he makes references. Right when Ernie sees the car, he reminded me of Toad from Toad Hall. Then I get the picture of the Disney Toad with the eyes going and everything. So you get a perfect picture of how he's being obsessed by the car. I really think, I agree that it's not out and out scary, but I think that sounds dismissive of this.
No, I mean, it makes you feel uneasy. That's what I mean. It
does. And I think that's its strength.
I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean it's not a pet cemetery where you are flat out terrified for the second half of the book. This is just a movie where you just feel almost sick to your stomach because you can see the inevitable road that this character is going to go on, and you see the people around him reaching out, trying to stop him, trying to save him, and they can't do anything.
Right. So as we said, the change in Ernie is much more gradual because you have the time in this novel to unwind, and there's a decision here in the movie that they've made, because maybe we could just talk about these things side to side rather than separately. But what they do is they have, obviously, the owner of the car sells Ernie the car in the book, Roland LeBay. So he's the bad guy of the book. It's not necessarily Christine, although there's something going on there, too. I always take it. And Dennis Dennis says several times, I don't know what's going on. I can't explain what is happening. Is the car possessed? Is LeBay possessing the car? I don't know. But I always got like an Annabelle the doll kind of feeling from this, where an inanimate object has attracted something, and LeBay is kind of feeding into that just because he's such a negative and evil person. So it's kind of like a perfect blending of the two things. And then the fact that the daughter dies in the car, and then the wife commits suicide in the car. And they say when Dennis goes to talk to LeBay's brother that LeBay put the daughter back in the car. Like that comes out later, almost like a sacrifice to the car. And then the wife, the suicide was another. So it's like the car is collecting spirits. It's very up to interpretation. But that makes it a little bit creepy because you don't know. And I don't think it would be as effective if it was explained flat out. This is a possessed car, and this is how it happened. Right. There was like a druid ceremony one night in the 50s, and that's how the car is possessed.
I think what it does, though, is it grounds the story a little bit more, because the one of the problems with the film, aside from the fact that you don't have all this character development and background, like we talked about this with Death on the Nile, you just don't have the time and space to build the characters the way that you do in a book. But the thing is, in the book, is that the fact that LeBay is the ghost who's actually possessing Ernie and or just possessing the car, right? Driving the car around, committing these murders, it grounds it a little bit more. Whereas in the film, you just can't get away from the fact that this is a killer car. And then it's suddenly just
it's like Knight Rider in the film.
And I think that's one of the things that works to its detriment in the film, because you're like, the car has its own personality.
Well, you see, this is crazy, because reading about this and listening to the commentary on the film with John Carpenter and Keith Gordon, which is a fascinating conversation because obviously Keith Gordon is now a renowned director in his own right. So it's like two peers talking to each other and asking each other about their processes. Carpenter, in the commentary and in the research material that I looked over, said that he thought that the supernatural aspects of the book were very clunky and they didn't work for him. And that's why they made a decision to streamline, because he thought it would be more of a hard sell to give the audience a ghost possessing this car than it would be for the car to be evil incarnate itself. And I disagree.
Me too.
And they referenced American Werewolf in London because they would think that audiences had seen that already with Griffin Dunn's character, with the disintegrating corpse throughout the movie. So they didn't want to repeat that either. But I'm missing LeBay. And I am mad, and maybe this is why you were mad in the first 2 minutes, that they have LeBay's brother sell him the car and not LeBay himself. And I see why they did that, because now you have somebody right out front that can tell them the story of LeBay, right? So it's not like you're going back halfway through the movie and then learning about it. You're learning about it firsthand from his brother. But it's confusing because he's got all the character traits of LeBay.
Of his brother, which is weird. It's like they just merged the two characters together.
Yeah. So who's possessing Arnie, this guy or LeBay? And the fact that if, on the Blu-ray, they've got deleted scenes. They went through that whole autographing the cast. They filmed that. But it makes no sense when you don't have LeBay in there.
Right.
Yeah.
So I can see why they took it out. Maybe they were thinking of trying to work it in at some point, but it's just a killer car, as you say.
And it makes it just to me a lot less plausible because of that. Because it's just harder for me to buy a demonic car than it is that like a ghost is driving. That makes more sense to me.
Well, when I saw the movie as a kid for the first time, this was the first R-rated movie I saw in the theater. So I thought I was the king of the world when I walked into there, because my father took me because he knew I loved this book. Like, even though the movie didn't tell me that LeBay was haunting the car, I think I put him behind the driver's seat and was trying to deny the fact that they were denying LeBay. And it's harder for me to do that now. And Carpenter even says that they wanted to keep it ambiguous, and that's why they have Christine's windshield and windows tinted, so you can't see if somebody's driving the car or not. So there's the question, well, is Arnie behind the wheel when he's killing all these people?
We did see him at one point at the end.
At the end, yeah. But there's also the part where Darnell calls after Buddy Repperton gets run down in the movie, and the car comes back into the garage, and then Darnell calls to make sure Arnie is where he's supposed to be, and he is. So that Arnie's not in the car there because Darnell opens the door.
Well, in the book, that is explicitly spelled out, that Arnie is never around when Christine goes out and does these killings. I will say, Buddy, Vinny Barbarino, this guy's like 26 years old.
So right? I looked this up because William Ostrander is 24.
Okay, that was close.
He looks about 30.
He does.
At least 26. Yeah.
If they had smell-o-vision on this movie, I could smell the cigarettes. I could smell the cigarettes when this guy comes on screen.
I mean, it is implied in the book that Buddy Repperton is maybe a guy who doesn't graduate on time.
Been left behind once or twice.
Yeah.
Well, he's in the shop class. Yeah.
But yeah, he was notably older than pretty much all the other actors.
My wife, when we were watching the movie, she's like, what are all these guys, 30? Like, she was talking about all the bullies in the shop class. I'm like, they probably all were held back quite a few years.
There was actually a kid in my high school, Forrest Stevens, and he looked well beyond our 17-year-old age. So. But
let me tell you, the character of Buddy Repperton in the book terrified me. He was the scariest thing to me as the Arnie sympathizing nerd in the book. He was scarier than Christine was, or LeBay put together was Buddy Repperton.
Yeah, see, and then the books, they all get their comeuppance. They need to be taken to task.
Spectacularly in the book, let me tell you.
And in the movie, I mean, there's more kills in the book. The movie just like I said, all the elements are there. It just goes by way too quick, and there's nothing is really grounded. I really, really miss Dennis's point of view of what's going on.
Well, that's the thing in the film, especially. I feel like the relationship with Lee gets really short shrift, and you just don't get enough time in the film with their relationship to feel, that.
No, you really don't understand why she's even with him.
And you know what's crazy is that I'm convinced that Lee is attracted to LeBay because she begins to see Ernie after the change. His complexion clears. Yep. He loses his he loses his glasses, which doesn't make sense because LeBay can't drive Christine because of his bad eyesight.
Because of his bad eyes, yeah.
Even though she's disgusted by LeBay later on, once she realizes what's going on, I think that's why she's with Ernie, because of the change. She would never have been with him or even considered the nerd Ernie, the pizza face Ernie, as they call him.
Well, I don't know. I mean, because there's still a lot of elements of Ernie's personality that are present when Lee starts dating him.
Well, hey, I had a great personality in high school, and Lee Cabot was not coming up to me. Let me tell you.
There we go.
But it does seem, because she notices the change, as he becomes more and more like Roland LeBay. And even Dennis says, like, the last time he saw the real Ernie was on Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
So Ernie's personality is there. It's still present. Like LeBay doesn't just sort of take him over completely, but he does start to become more and more dominant as the book goes on.
Yeah. And the fact that Christine herself, the car, begins to we don't know that it's regenerating. We just know that there's a very bizarre way that Ernie is going about restoring her. Very random things like, he didn't replace the windshield, but he's got new windshield wipers. He put the new antenna on before doing anything else so he could listen to the radio. And then like the half a grill part, like half the grill is new and half is not. That is imbuing a sense of dread as well, because you're not told explicitly in the beginning that the car is regenerating itself, but you're just wondering, what is Ernie doing? And I think this would have been really cinematic, actually, if they had kept this aspect, because Ernie's back starts to give out in the book and it gets worse and worse and worse. And of course, we knew that LeBay had a back brace and he had a bad back. And Ernie keeps asking himself, because there's always these inner questions, because this is what I love. Okay, Dennis does ground the book in the beginning and in the end, but he doesn't in the middle. And that's when you get to see Ernie's viewpoint. And this is the scariest part of the book for me, or the most dreadful part of the book for me, is Ernie's inner turmoil when he's asking himself, how did you hurt your back, Ernie? Yeah, and he's in denial. And then when it's finally revealed that in order for Christine to regenerate, she has to move forward in order for the odometer to go backwards. And that he's been pushing her in the back of Darnell's lot. And that's how he screwed up his back. So the more that Christine runs, the more she becomes like new again. And I love that. I love that visual of Ernie struggling, lovingly pushing this car until he brings her back to health. And I think that would have been a fantastic visual that they lost out on.
Yeah. And we talked about a little bit about how Jeff mentioned how the kill scenes are like more elaborate, sort of more spectacular in the book. And one that I found really affecting both times I read it for a couple of different reasons. But when Christine breaks into Darnell's house in the book,
it's like a tank.
It made me think immediately of the shark busting into the orca at the end at the end of Jaws, like that feeling like where the shark keeps ramming the boat, right? Yep. Until he finally comes through. And that's what happens with Christine, where she sort of keeps ramming the house until she gets through and kind of like achieves her objective. But I had a little bit of PTSD. So I don't know if I ever told you guys this. When I was 12 years old, a guy fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into our house.
Oh, geez.
And when Darnell
was it a Plymouth Fury?
It was not a Plymouth Fury. It was a guy in a compact car who our house is on
Ford Fiesta.
Our house is on a curve. My parents' house is on a curve. And if you keep driving straight instead of turning, you will drive straight into my parents' house. And it was the middle of the night. It was dead asleep. My bedroom was downstairs. And I heard the crash and I woke up and went into the hallway, and the whole hallway was covered in glass because we had one of those like all glass, like weather doors, behind the front door. and all the glass had shattered all the way down the hall. And there was a guy standing in the front door with a cut on his head going, "Is everyone okay?" And the front wall of the house had actually like buckled a little bit. You could see like where it was cracked all the way across the living room. And I had such a vivid memory of that when I was reading this part of the book, especially when Darnell was talking about the glass flying everywhere and the shards of glass. Like a car, even when it's not trying to break your house, can do a lot of damage.
Yeah.
A lot of the kills are all memorable. And I love the Moochie kill, which Christine just runs over him ragged until he's not even identifiable as a human being, which they, for some reason, Carpenter chose not to go, there's barely any blood in the movie, except for Ernie's at the end. But Moochie is just run ragged. And I love the description. And again, going back to the odometer, as Christine's driving away and he's describing the car regenerating, he's describing it as negating that the murder ever happened. It's going back in time before the murder. And the last dent to come out of her was the first one that was made. Yeah. I just love that concept of turning back time, literally with this car going back in time. And when you step into it, the vision that Dennis has that first day when he sits down in her, and then on that nightmare ride that he takes with Ernie later on, just the fact that you go into a time warp when you go into this car.
It's not that the film has to be gory, but it is a surprise considering this is the first film Carpenter made after The Thing, which is extremely gory, And
you could tell that he's very hurt still by the reaction that The Thing got when it was first released. He says that he took Christine as a job more than anything else. It wasn't a personal thing for him like The Thing was, or Halloween, or the previous films, but he was afraid after the drubbing that The Thing took that he was unemployable. And he was nervous that he couldn't get a job. And he took this that came along and was offered to him as a job. And maybe, and he doesn't say this explicitly, maybe he was shying away from that. Maybe that he took some of that criticism to heart from The Thing. I don't know.
It does feel pretty workmanlike, this movie. Like it doesn't feel inspired the way a lot lot of his other movies.
Although you can tell it does have a Carpenter feel to it. You can tell.
For the score, if nothing else. I feel like his scores are pretty distinct.
Absolutely. And this score has stayed with me, the synthesizer score. But just some of the shots in here, especially when Ernie steps back and the headlights come on and he watches Christine regenerate. I think that is extremely Carpenter-esque. There's some little things and you could tell you can get that flavor, just like you can get the King flavor when you're reading the book. Talking about kills again, the Repperton kill in the movie it's very much scaled down, if you can call a massive explosion scaled down. I was missing the chase that happens in the book. It's really Buddy's car versus Christine in that book. And there's a race in the middle of the state park where nobody is. And it's a really suspenseful sequence. Buddy gets much more of a comeuppance in the book than he does in the movie. It's kind of over really quickly in the movie. And I never understood, even as a kid, why is this guy running in the middle of the road away from a car? Run off the road.
Run off to the side. Hide behind a tree.
Like, that's the question I ask in every single Godzilla film. Like, why do people run straight ahead of Godzilla? Why don't they run to the side?
Yeah, I could bring up Prometheus for that one. I will say the one thing in the movie that is very well done is a Christine on fire chasing after you is very scary visual.
That is a great visual. That's the trailer moment right there.
Yeah,
definitely.
I will say in the book, though, I felt really cheated by Ernie's death happening off page, and we're only told about it afterwards. I really felt that we were kind of cheated out of, because we just find out from Dennis after the fact that Ernie and his mom.
Yeah, well, that's the drawback of having Dennis narrate, because you can't be there with Ernie because you're looking at it through Dennis's point of view again. So I love the Dennis parts. I was missing it though, where Dennis takes over as narrator again. I kind of was missing the Ernie point of view from that point on. Even though I love the Dennis part in the beginning, and I was a jarring transition into the second part of the book, I was missing the second part of the book when it goes back to Dennis.
Right. The choice that Stephen King ends up making is that the confrontation with Christine is paramount. So that's why Arnie's death has to happen off screen.
And you get a sense, you don't know, but you get a sense the way that Dennis tells it and the way that the truck driver witnesses it, that it looks like there's 3 people in the car.
That's correct. Right.
So Dennis wants to think that Arnie was finally standing up for himself against LeBay and that there was a fight going on in the car. And I can only imagine what Regina is thinking because she's unaware of any of this possession stuff. But we do have that redemption for Arnie in the book, possibly, that you do not get in the movie. He is with that car to the very, very end in the movie. Whatever Arnie was there before is completely gone, because as he dies, he's caressing the front end of Christine. But that's a great jump scare, though, when Lee comes after he flies through the windshield and he just jumps up. Oh, and I jumped out of my seat because I had forgotten about that.
I was glad that Harry Dean Stanton didn't die, though.
And he dies in the book. Yeah, that's another kill from the book that you don't see. Now, Junkins in the book, who is going to think that the car is doing it himself? But Junkins obviously knows something is wrong, that it's got to be Arnie's car that's committing these murders, but there's no evidence that shows. And I'm thinking to myself, because during the Darnell section, when Christine drives into his house, you're reading about how the hood's flying off, there's parts. It's got to leave evidence all over the place as it's driving away, but they don't really talk about that. But yeah, Junkins gets taken out in the book, run off the road, obviously by Christine, although you're not explicitly told that, but he survives in the movie. Apparently he knows what's going on in the movie, because he tells them they're all in the junkyard at the end watching Christine get crushed. You kids are heroes. You took out the evil car that drove by itself. He doesn't say that. That's what he's thinking. We haven't talked about Keith Gordon at all as Arnie.
He's really good in this.
He is. He plays it very broad, I have to say. He's got some bugging out eyes through a lot of this stuff, like especially during that scene when he's giving Dennis his New Year's Eve cruise. In the book, this is like Dennis's last chance of trying to connect with the old Arnie in the book. And they go back in time. Like when Dennis is in the car, not only does he get that like death smell that everybody gets except for Arnie when they're in Christine, it looks like he's back in the 50s and the radio comes on and it's like a broadcast from the 50s. They stay away from that in the movie. Now, Carpenter does say in the commentary that they tried to do something during that drive to make it look like it was daylight outside the car when they got in. And they tried it with floodlights while they were in there, so it would like illuminate the road in front of them. But the effect didn't work. So they dropped it. But I'm thinking to myself, why can't you just film it in daytime inside the car? Why do you have to simulate daytime from inside the car? For one reason or other, he wanted to make it a character scene rather than a special effects scene. I think that Keith Gordon does bring us along, even though the movie is missing a lot of those supernatural aspects and missing the explicit LeBay possession. I think that you do see the change in Keith Gordon from nerd to this creepy 50s guy. It's a bit more ambiguous as to, like, he's changing to the time period of the car rather than to a person like LeBay. And talking about the final scene, Petunia, which is the sewage truck that they use to ram Christine, has kind of a personality of its own that the bulldozer just is not Petunia. The bulldozer is not Petunia.
Petunia's character development fell by the wayside.
That's a little poetic, though. They're taking out the.
Yes, it is. It very much is. And you know what I love about the movie is that shot, and this is very Carpenter-esque as well, when Dennis gets hit on the football field, and you see the camera, his point of view, going to Lee and Arnie making out, and it's the first time he's seen Christine restored, and he's already been shot down by Lee in the library. So the fact that he's trying to process not only the car, but his friend making out with this girl and then getting hit. And then the bully's applauding after he gets hit. I'm like, would these guys even be at a football game? Come on.
No.
By the way, felt so bad for Roseanne in that scene in the library. She looks so crushed when Dennis walks
Kelly
past
Preston.
her.
Kelly
I know.
Preston.
She was so young, and she just looks absolutely heartbroken. She looks up, she sees him walking toward her, and he keeps going.
Walk right by.
I'm like, no.
23 cars were utilized. They managed to find 23 Plymouth Furies for the movie. And only a couple, they destroyed most of them. Obviously, there's only a couple that remain. I think there's one is owned by a collector in Pensacola, Florida. I would feel uneasy with that car in my garage, I think. Definitely.
I know, right? Yeah, you can keep it.
Yeah.
Say about Christine's pulse, she's a little bit like the One Ring, right? She's kind of like drawing people toward her and then changing them when they possess her.
My precious, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
My precious.
It's a hard pass for me.
Some fun facts that I gleaned from the commentary. Keith Gordon, to this day, uses the shoulder bag that Ernie uses in the beginning of the movie. He kept the bag and he uses it and he brings it on set for his movies. They hired William Ostrander because he had a very Travolta-esque quality. And it's a similar character, actually, to what Travolta played in Carrie.
Yeah.
And this is like a similar, setup, actually. It's like a male version of Carrie with a car involved. Alexandra Paul, a vegetarian. So during her famous scene where she chokes on the hamburger, she actually pushed the meat back. She didn't want to make a big deal or be a diva and say that she is a vegetarian, so she couldn't eat this. She pushed the meat back, so only ate the bun. So the meat did not touch her lips.
Interesting.
And
I feel like this is the type of movie that's just ripe for a serious remake.
It is. Blumhouse.
I did read that.
In 2021.
Are they remaking it or a sequel?
They're remaking it.
They're remaking.
Remake, reboot, whatever. Yeah.
Okay.
About the book, which I'm surprised you haven't mentioned, Jim, is that it's obviously a love letter to Romero's Pittsburgh.
Yes, the Monroeville Mall. I am actually wearing my WGON shirt right now in deference to that. The many references to the Monroeville Mall were very much appreciated. Thank you, Mr.
Yeah,
King.
except the movie, it all takes place in California.
Right.
They couldn't even...
Because Carpenters in California.
Yeah. Just
all
swap
Carpenters
out a license plate. All you had to do.
Kevin Bacon was set to play Ernie.
Mm-hmm.
And he went for Footloose instead. He was offered Footloose. And
I think that worked out for him.
I think it did work out for him.
Right?
Yeah. They also were looking at Scott Baio for Ernie at one point.
Was this before or after he did Zapped?
I think maybe after he lost this, he did Zapped as a consolation prize. And they were looking at Brooke Shields for Lee. Maybe. Nicolas Cage auditioned for Buddy Repperton. Didn't get him.
He wasn't old enough.
And did you notice the license plate in the movie? CQB, which stands for Close Quarters Battle, which is a military term. So I don't know why that they chose that, but that's what it stands for.
Military?
Maybe, could be. Maybe it was a vanity plate from LeBay.
Yeah, I don't think that guy could afford a vanity plate.
And yeah, and just looking at my notes from the commentary, when Keith Gordon and John are watching the Moochie death scene and they see it end with just the camera closing in on his midriff, Carpenter commented, he's like, "Oh, there's no blood here." It's like, this is like a PG-13 movie. He's saying this isn't R. And then they said that they actually had to beef it up with some profanity to make it R. And he says, "Yeah, very little blood, one of my wimpier efforts." And that's a quote from John Carpenter. So the movie wasn't a huge box office success. It was a Christmas release, December 9th, 1983. So came out the same year that the book was published. Cost $10 million to make, and it made $21 million. And I was one of those that went to go see it on opening weekend at the Juliet Theater in Poughkeepsie, New York. I remember. Critics were divided. Variety said, "Christine feels like a retread." I see what you did there, Variety. I see what you did there. But Roger Ebert, Chicago, he liked it. Said, "This is the kind of movie that you walk out with a silly grin, get in your car, and lay rubber down the Eisenhower."
Wow.
Roger Ebert was always a funny one, which is why I really appreciate his reviews, because you think of him as being sort of really highbrow, but like this is a guy who wrote screenplays for Roger Corman, and like he had a real appreciation for genre film, I think.
Like you say, it's surprising sometimes the things that he likes. And sometimes it's surprising the things that he doesn't like because of what he's liked before. Right. But Jeff, you were saying that you remembered this primarily for the defecation on the dashboard.
Yeah, I guess for whatever reason it stuck with me.
What's always stuck with me is that Arnie's saying to Dennis, she's 20 years old, Dennis. That means she's an antique. I have taken that with me for the rest of my life. That's 20 years old. That means it's an antique. Old. Yeah. What are we if that's...
we are very antique. Oh
but I will complain about this. And I'm that guy, and I'm going to be that guy right now. This book and the movie, by the way, takes place in 1978 going into 1979. And as you said before, Jeff, that Stephen King at the beginning of every single chapter has, a lyric. And he mentions music many times in the book. At one point, he mentions Jukebox Hero by Foreigner coming on the radio. 1981. 1981, Mr. King. And then he also mentions You May Be Right at one point by Billy Joel, 1980. So didn't do your research there.
Well, the copy editors usually catch that stuff. When I did, I was actually really careful because the Ghost Tree is set in the 80s. And I was very, very carefully researching when anything that I mentioned, period, like a film, a song, an album, whatever, was mentioned in the book. And I actually, one of the copy editors told me that one of the songs had not been released that year, and I sent her the Billboard chart listing, and I was like, "I'm sorry, you're wrong."
Oh. What song was it?
It was a David Lee Roth song.
Oh, okay.
I know it had been released twice, right? It had been released, I think, as a single, and then the album came out later. So I think she was going by possibly the album release,
the EP, yeah.
And I was like, oh no, it was out. So I sent her the Billboard chart listing. But that's what the copy editor, one of the things the copy editor does is they sort of fact check your references. So maybe his copy editor didn't catch that.
Do you think when it's somebody like Stephen King, they're afraid to call him out on stuff like that? Like little stuff like that?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah,
you call him. I'm not going to
tell him. You tell him.
It was pretty early in his career, so.
Well, no, The Shining was out by that time. He was big news by 83.
He was big, but I mean, usually nobody's above copy editing, except Anne Rice, apparently. Anne Rice was famously not edited at all after a certain point.
Well, neither was King after a certain point, right?
No, I think he works with an editor. I think Stephen King probably has a little more respect for editors than Anne Rice does or did. Okay. Anne Rice flat out said that she didn't like editors coming in and changing her things. And it's such a honestly weird way of looking at that relationship. I think people who aren't in the publishing business think that the relationship with the editor is adversarial, and it's not. The editor's working with you to try to make the book better. You can take or leave the changes. You know what I mean? You're not required to take them. It's not like they're a dictator imposing their will on your manuscript. It's more that they're saying, look, I think this would be tighter if we took this out, or I think that this would be stronger if we expanded this part. And that's, they're just trying to help you shape the book a lot, very much in the way like a film editor shapes all the footage that a director hands them. And as the author, you have the right to say yes or no, just like a director has the right to say yes or no to those cuts when they come back from the editor. So, I think that a guy like Stephen King, who's been in this industry for a long time, he probably has a little more say-so than some people, and he probably has some pretty strong feelings about what he's writing and what he wants on the page. But I think also he probably has, after such a long career, he probably has a pretty good respect for the role of the editor and what the editor can do for your book.
They didn't point out Foreigner or Billy Joel in this case.
Yeah.
So it remained. Mm-hmm.
Just noticed that in the book, when they go to the drive-in, they watch Grease, because obviously it was 1978. But in the movie, they probably couldn't get the rights, so they had to go Silver Streak.
Speaking of Grease, I thought that their high school jackets looked a lot like the Rydell High jackets.
They did. Dennis's jacket was like the same color as Christine, the red and white. I think there's a lot of red and white going on in the movie.
Yeah, that's a theme.
Stephen King, I think, is overlooked sometimes because there's moments of beauty. One line that I loved right before the death scene of Buddy and his drinking buddies in the car. He's describing the scene before Buddy comes into it. Snow-covered fields lay dreaming on either side of the road, twinkling in a dozen points of light that mimed the stars in a black winter sky. Oh. And then Buddy's brutally killed a few pages later. King cannot resist a creepy epilogue as well. Like, he cannot let the characters just have his happy ending. Sandy Galton, who was the airport attendant, because in the book, Arnie takes Christine out of Darnell's because he has a compromise with his parents. So he parks it out at the airport because his father thinks it would be a good idea. And he takes the bus back and forth to take Christine out. And that's where Christine is brutalized by the gang. So there's an attendant at the airport that lets them in, and his name is Sandy Galton. And he skips town after Moochie dies because he's smart. But at the very end of the book, Sandy has relocated to California, and he's working at a drive-in, and it says that a car drives through the concession stand and kills him. And so Dennis is of the opinion that this was Christine and that it's making its way back across the country to eventually get him. So, and that's how the book ends. So not a happy ending for our characters in Christine. King can't resist. And one more fun fact before we go and give our buckets on this, that George Thorogood was in the junkyard scene at the end, but his acting was so abysmal that they cut him. So there are photos of him on set. He was the crane operator that actually crushes Christine at the end. Because this was the first time, and Carpenter swears by this, and that he said it's been used a million times since, but he was the first one to use bad to the bone in a movie.
Interesting. And now people can't help but use it.
Yeah. So, okay. So what kind of buckets would we give to the book and to the movie? If you asked me when I was 12, I'd give like 5 buckets to this book without question, because it was my favorite book growing up. So I agree with Carpenter to an extent that the supernatural element of the book, Christine, is a little bit clunky because I don't think that shows enough old Arnie. It's too much bad Arnie, not enough old Arnie. So I don't think that there's as much push and pull as there should be. So there were things like that I was a little bit disappointed with, that I didn't really catch when I was younger. So because of that, I'm going to give it 4.5, the book. The movie, as I said before, is a different animal, and it's not beholden to the book. It's its own thing. I love Keith Gordon. I don't like the fact that they have Christine as its own evil entity. It makes the development of Arnie into this monster a bit more ambiguous as to what's going on. The performances are great, though, and I think it's a hallmark of the 80s cinema for me. I'm going to give the movie probably 3.5 buckets.
So I have read all of Stephen King's books. So in the pantheon of Stephen King books, this is sort of in the middle for me. I liked it when I read it, and I liked it when I read it again. But it's not one of my super favorites of his. So for me, the book is like a 3.5. You know, it's Stephen King. He could write in his sleep, and he basically did write Cujo in his sleep, as he says. He wrote about this in On Writing. He was so drunk and high he does not remember writing that book. So obviously he could write a decent book in his sleep. But this is, Not really one of my super favorites. And as far as Carpenter films go, this is really a sad disappointment for me. It just doesn't feel like anything. It has its good qualities, but it's not a great film overall. It's not hard to watch per se. It's just not great. So probably like a 2.5 for the film.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you there. I really enjoyed reading this book. I don't read as much as you guys do. I just don't have the time. It's a different discipline. But I thoroughly enjoyed curling up on the couch with the wife and just we're all in our two little worlds reading books together. I'll give this a solid 4 as far as the book goes. I really enjoyed it. I agree with you wholeheartedly on the movie. The movie just doesn't work for me at all. It's especially coming off reading everything and then watching this movie. It's unfortunate, comparing the two. And we mentioned it. It's a completely different discipline. It's a different medium altogether. But I'll go 3. I'll go 3 on the movie.
Because the strong point of the movie for me, I think, is Keith Gordon. I wish I could remember back to when I read it before I saw the movie, but reading it since then, you can't think of anybody but Keith Gordon.
Yeah, I agree with you
in that character role.
Although reading Dennis, I really felt like a Emilio Estevez type of a character, like right out of Breakfast Club, his jock character. But I really enjoyed reading the book. So,
all right. So what are we doing next week?
Oh, I think we're going Disney Plus.
We are.
Yeah.
We're going Pixar, Disney Plus.
Yes.
We're giving Pixar the props they deserve next week.
Front and center. Deservedly so. This Turning Red is getting some good buzz. So
I've already seen it. I've actually I watched it. I watched it opening night. So
okay. All right.
I'll watch it again before we talk about it. And along with Turning Red, it's a color scheme we're going with, but also a thematic scheme, hopefully, once all is said and done. Ginger Snaps, which is a werewolf movie from the early aughts, and both about more or less girls coming of age in different ways, in wildly different ways.
Wildly different ways. Yeah, all right. I'll be there.
Thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Hello, everybody. If you liked the podcast you just heard, then please follow TMI on all of our social media outlets. First and foremost, email us at tmipodcast2018@gmail.com. That is tmipodcast2018@gmail.com.
And you can follow us on Twitter at TMI_podcast2018. Stop over, say hi, give us a compliment. We'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Make sure you follow us on Instagram as well, which is also TMI_podcast2018.
And of course, we are on Facebook, facebook.com/TMI Podcast 2018. And it should be noted, we also have a community page, so join the forum.
And if you like to watch YouTube, you can see us at TMI Podcast 2018, all one word. Look for the popcorn bucket.
Popcorn bucket. Or you could just go to our website, which has every link there, TMIConfessionalspodcast.com. And we'll see you at the concession stand.
We'll save some popcorn for you.
I had a great personality in high school, and Lee Cabot was not coming up to me. Let me tell you.